What could a modern aircraft carrier and a ship built more than 1,000 years ago by the hands of Vikings without a single iron nail have in common? How could peoples from the cold shores of Scandinavia create vessels nearly 90 meters long, which still astonish engineers today? But the main thing is, why did they need such giants? The answer to this question is hidden in the ancient sound of axes and the smell of fresh oak, in those mysteries that have survived centuries and are still not fully unraveled. According to descriptions by medieval chroniclers, such colossal vessels like the legendary Drakkar did not merely sail, they flew across the waves. The ships on which Vikings conquered the seas were built according to the principle of overlapping plank riveting, which historians call clinker construction. This meant that each plank was laid over the previous one, like scales on the body of a sea monster. Thanks to this, the ship turned out light, flexible, and fast, capable of surviving the blows of northern storms. Archaeological finds in Roskilde, Denmark, confirm. Even after 1,000 years, these hulls retain their shape as if they were built yesterday. Such an assembly method required incredible precision. An error the thickness of a fingernail could cost the vessel its life. Vikings used a tool that today would be called an edge axe, a wide blade with the help of which the master could fit each plank with millimeter precision. One wrong blow and weeks of work would be for naught. Among Vikings, there was a special word for masters capable of building a ship, skipasmid. These were not just artisans, but priests of wood and wind. Their knowledge was passed down orally from generation to generation and was worth more than gold. After all, a Drakkar was not merely transport, it was a symbol of the clan's soul. Imagine the noise of a coastal village, dozens of people working shoulder to shoulder, the smell of tar and salt tickling nostrils, and above it all rises the skeleton of a future marvel, long as a battlefield and slender as an arrow. Each frame is bent precisely to the master's palm, each plank as if finding its own place. Historians believe that such gigantic vessels, like the legendary sea serpent from Sorlanded, could reach lengths of up to 90 meters, accommodating over 100 warriors. And all this without blueprints, without measuring instruments, only by memory and by eye. But the most mysterious thing is not the dimensions, but how these vessels maintained stability on the waves. Modern engineers still debate how Vikings achieved the ideal ratio between lightness and strength. Perhaps the answer lies in the way they connected wood and sea into a single living creature. When a wave struck the hull, the Drakkar did not break. It bent. It lived. As if the ocean itself accepted it into its ranks. And as archaeologists clear the remains of ancient planks from the silt, in these curves one can hear the breath of an era when man and sea spoke the same language. But what compelled them to build such enormous ships? A thirst for glory, trade, or something more? The desire to go beyond the edge of the known world, where maps ended and legends began. The answer lies in the construction technology itself and in who stood at the helm of these sea monsters. When archaeologists first raised the remains of a ship from Roskilde Fjord, they could not believe their eyes. Enormous oak planks, as if alive, retained the curve set by the master 1,000 years ago. These fragments belonged to a so-called longship, a category of vessels created not for cargo transport, but for war and sudden strike. Long, narrow, almost without superstructures, they cut through the sea as if its surface were a smooth road. It was in such vessels that the principle that became the heart of the Scandinavian marvel was embodied: symmetrical construction from keel to sides. The keel, that is, the central beam, served as the ship's backbone. This term meant not just a structural detail. The keel gave the entire vessel its soul and direction. Without a perfectly straight keel, the ship did not sail, but struggled against the waves, like a person with a broken spine. Therefore, the laying of the keel was considered a sacred ritual. Offerings were brought to it, coins were placed, and sometimes even a drop of animal blood to appease the gods of the sea. Modern wood research shows that masters selected trees with a natural curve in their trunks for the ship's future ribs. They did not bend the wood, they sought its ready-made form in the forest. This is not engineering, this is a symphony of wood and man. One researcher wrote that an experienced skipasmid could see the ship inside the oak, just as a sculptor sees a statue inside a stone. To join the planks, Vikings used ox sinews and tar. This method, known as soam planking, allowed the hull to be watertight and flexible at the same time. Amazingly, such connections withstood no less than modern metal rivets. In the saga of Harold Fairhair, there is a mention that the ships of his fleet could cross a storm when waves struck higher than the masts. This is not a poetic exaggeration. Calculations by maritime historians show that a dracker with a flexible hull could tilt almost 40 degrees without losing stability. The construction process itself resembled a military ritual. First, a plot of land by the water was chosen, the so-called ship's bed. Masters dug a pit, laid the keel there, and raised the sides in layers, securing each plank with wooden tree nails, pegs made of elm. After each row, the hull was coated with a mixture of tar and whale oil. This scent permeated skin, hair, and clothing, reminding them that the sea would now be a part of their lives. According to archaeological data, the construction of one large drakkar required about 40 oak trees and the labor of 50 people for a year. Not a single blueprint, no records. Everything existed only in the master's head and in his memory. Young apprentices stood nearby, memorizing every gesture, every sound of the axe, like a prayer. One 12th century chronicler wrote, "A skipasmid sees the sea before the ship touches the water." The Vikings themselves called these vessels dragons, not by chance. A monster's head was carved on the prow, intended to ward off evil spirits and enemies. This element was called drak, hence the word drakkar. Sometimes, according to legends, masters hid pieces of amber in the dragon's eyes so that the vessel would see its way even in a storm. Archaeological finds indeed confirm the presence of stone or amber inlays in the prow decorations. The sound of hammers, the creak of wood, the smell of salt, all merged into one feeling. They were building not just a ship, but a path to glory. The drakkar became an extension of their body, a means to prove their strength to the gods. When the vessel was launched, the entire clan came out to the shore. Women brought bread, children held ropes, elders cast the ashes of burnt coal into the sea, a symbol of the eternal journey. Modern engineers from the Norwegian Maritime Museum attempted to recreate a similar ship and encountered an unexpected problem. Oak growing today has a different fiber structure, looser, less dense. That is, even if we have blueprints, we cannot fully replicate the ancient technology. Vikings worked with wood that no longer grows as it did 1,000 years ago. When the finished hull first began to breathe with the wind, the masters said that the ship had awakened. From that moment on, it no longer belonged to men, but to the sea. And everyone who stepped onto the deck knew ahead lay a path into the unknown, where only the strength of hand and will of heart could keep it afloat. But before these giants set off on their expeditions, they had to undergo a trial that determined whether the ship was worthy of seeing the waves of the North Sea. When the drakkar was ready, its life was only beginning. The first trial was called the Sea Test, an unofficial but crucial moment that could put an end to a year's worth of labor. The ship was launched into the water in complete silence. Not a word, not a song, only the creak of ropes and the dull thud of wood against water. If the vessel settled evenly, without listing, if the wind touched the sail as if greeting it, the masters nodded silently. The ship was accepted by the sea. If the hull began to play, bending unnaturally, the drakkar was dismantled, without regret, without complaint, because Vikings believed it was better to sink wood than to sink people. This test was not just a technical act, but part of a maritime cult. The sailors themselves called it Seder, a magical consecration. Seder was not witchcraft, but a way to hear the will of the elements. They cast burnt branches into the water, observing whether they sank or floated. This is how they determined if the sea would accept the new ship. Archaeologists have found charred pieces of wood near construction sites, and many researchers consider this a direct trace of this ritual. After the water's approval, the next stage began: rigging. The main pride of the Drakkar was its sail. It was woven from wool, impregnated with animal fat and blood to be waterproof. Yes, the Viking sail was literally alive. It smelled. It absorbed salt and sun, and with each voyage it became denser because of this. Researchers from the University of Oslo have proven such a woolen sail could withstand gusts of wind that would tear modern synthetic fabrics to pieces. The mast, that was the heart of the vessel. It was installed manually, without hoisting mechanisms. Dozens of men raised the heavy log with ropes, while women sang rhythmic songs to set the tempo and maintain harmony between their bodies. This moment was so important that some sagas state, when the mast is raised, the ship acquires a name. The name was not chosen by the owner, but by the wind itself, according to how the first gust touched the sail. But tests of strength were still ahead. Each new Drakkar had to undergo the so-called rower's trial. This sounds simple, but in reality, it was hell. 50 and sometimes more than 100 people sat on the benches and rowed against the wind, testing the vessel's balance and flexibility. But before these giants set off on their expeditions, they had to undergo a trial that determined whether the ship was worthy of seeing the waves of the North Sea. When the Drakkar was ready, its life was only beginning. The first trial was called the Sea Test, an unofficial but crucial moment that could put an end to a year's worth of labor. The ship was launched into the water in complete silence. Not a word, not a song, only the creak of ropes and the dull thud of wood against water. If the vessel settled evenly, without listing, if the wind touched the sail as if greeting it, the masters nodded silently. The ship was accepted by the sea. If the hull began to play, bending unnaturally, the Drakkar was dismantled, without regret, without complaint, because Vikings believed it was better to sink wood than to sink people. This test was not just a technical act, but part of a maritime cult. The sailors themselves called it Seder, a magical consecration. Seder was not witchcraft, but a way to hear the will of the elements. They cast burnt branches into the water, observing whether they sank or floated. This is how they determined if the sea would accept the new ship. Archaeologists have found charred pieces of wood near construction sites, and many researchers consider this a direct trace of this ritual. After the water's approval, the next stage began: rigging. The main pride of the Drakkar was its sail. It was woven from wool, impregnated with animal fat and blood to be waterproof. Yes, the Viking sail was literally alive. It smelled, it absorbed salt and sun, and because of this, with each voyage it became denser. Researchers from the University of Oslo have proven such a woolen sail could withstand gusts of wind that would tear modern synthetic fabrics to pieces. The mast, that was the heart of the vessel. It was installed manually, without hoisting mechanisms. Dozens of men raised the heavy log with ropes, while women sang rhythmic songs to set the tempo and maintain harmony between their bodies. This moment was so important that some sagas state, when the mast is raised, the ship acquires a name. The name was not chosen by the owner, but by the wind itself, according to how the first gust touched the sail. But tests of strength were still ahead. Each new Drakkar had to undergo the so-called rower's trial. This sounds simple, but in reality, it was hell. 50 and sometimes more than 100 people sat on the benches and rowed against the wind, testing the vessel's balance and flexibility. The rowers felt how the hull breathed beneath them. Planks creaked, water seeped into cracks, the wind ripped oars from their hands. If after an hour of rowing the hull remained dry and did not break rhythm, the vessel was considered ready for the expedition. If not, the Vikings returned to their axes. Among sailors, there was an expression, "A ship lives as long as its keel lives." This was not a metaphor, but a technical fact. The keel held all the weight and direction. To strengthen it, masters used a special resin mixed with coal dust and animal hair. This black mass, found during excavations in Sorelandet, astonished scientists with its strength. 1,000 years later, it still had not disintegrated. During the trials, the ship underwent another mystery, the combat test. Vikings simulated an attack. Several people ran across the deck, clashing shields, to check the hull's stability. The sound of blows, the creak of planks, the smell of sweat and tar, all this transformed the vessel into a living creature, ready for battle. One chronicler wrote, "When the Drakkar accepted the weight of the warriors, it became part of their flesh." Modern maritime engineers are surprised. How did a vessel built without metal frames and rivets withstand such stress? The answer? In the flexibility of the design. Vikings used a principle that today is called a floating keel. That is, the hull was not rigidly fixed, but could move slightly upon impact with a wave. This effect worked like a modern car suspension, dampening vibrations and preventing the vessel from breaking apart. After all checks, the ship was decorated. Shields were fastened along the edges of the board, not for protection, but as a sign of belonging. Each shield told of the clan, of exploits, of blood shed for glory. When the Drakkar stood by the shore, these round discs sparkled like the scales of a giant fish. In the northern sagas, it was said, "When the sun strikes the shields, the enemy sees death even before hearing the cry of the rowers." And so, when the vessel passed all trials, it was accepted by the Jarl, the chieftain whose name was now linked with the ship's fate. He performed the final rite, struck the side with his palm, and pronounced, "Go, and do not return empty." These words did not mean a curse, it was a Viking blessing. For every ship had to bring either wealth or glory or death. There was no third option. At this moment a hum rose over the shore. Drums, the roar of horns, the clang of weapons. The expedition began. Drakkars departed towards the horizon, like a flock of giant birds, and only the salty wind knew which of them would return. When a fleet of Drakkars emerged from the fjord, the sea transformed into a mirror of steel. The wind struck the sails, and the heavy ships, created without a single blueprint, began to move with such speed that chroniclers compared them to a lynx running across the water. Historians believe that the best Drakkars could reach up to 15 knots, faster than many European vessels of the Middle Ages. For Vikings, this meant power over the sea, where every extra stroke of the oar determined destiny. The main strength of the Drakkar was not only its speed, but also its maneuverability. Unlike cumbersome medieval galleys, Viking ships had a shallow draft, only about a meter. This allowed them to enter directly into river mouths, where the enemy did not expect an attack. Modern archaeologists call such a design a universal platform. At that time, Vikings simply said, "Our ship goes where fish swim and where people live." The key steering element was called the steering board, in Norwegian, steerboard. From this word later came the modern starboard, the right side of the ship. This board was attached to the stern, and it was steered by a person called a steerman, the helmsman. He was not just a steersman, but effectively the second commander after the Jarl. Everything depended on his intuition. If he erred, the Drakkar could capsize on a wave. According to chroniclers' descriptions, the helmsman stood barefoot, feeling the ship with his feet. When a wave struck, he did not look at a compass. They didn't exist. He listened to the sound of the hull. Vikings said, "A good helmsman hears when the ship is afraid." Archaeological finds of the rudder from the Oseberg ship show that it was carved not just to steer, but to dampen vibrations from the water's impact. It was a masterpiece of hydrodynamics long before the advent of science. To stay on course, not maps, but signs of the sea were used: wind direction, flight of birds, water color, the smell of salt. Of particular importance were sunstones, transparent calcite crystals that refracted light even through clouds. Historians long considered this a myth until such a crystal was found on a 16th-century English ship in 2012, proof that the technology truly existed. Vikings could determine the sun's position with an accuracy of several degrees, even in cloudy weather. When Drakkars went on an expedition, each rower had his own place, a bench fastened to the side. Oars passed through openings covered with leather sleeves to prevent water from entering. These openings were called oar, from the word meaning breath. Vikings said, "Oar, these are the ship's lungs." The better they breathed, the faster the Drakkar went. Oars were made of ash, a flexible yet strong wood, capable of withstanding tens of thousands of strokes against the water. During voyages, iron discipline prevailed on board. The crew was divided into sides, left and right, like two arms of one body. When a horn signal was given, the rowers had to strike in unison. Breaking the rhythm was severely punished, not by a whip, but by shame. A Viking who broke the rhythm lost respect, and thus the right to a share of the plunder. Provisions on board were simple: dried meat, fish, oatcakes, and beer diluted with seawater. Everything was designed for survival on a long voyage. Every drop of fresh water was accounted for. In the cold seas, the northerners conserved energy by rowing short but powerful strokes. Shifts occurred every 2 hours to conserve strength. When a storm began, the sail was furled, and they took to the oars. This was a moment of truth. The sea tested not only the vessel, but also the people. Waves rose like mountains, the mast bent under the wind, and the keel groaned like a living creature. And yet, the Drakkars survived. Thanks to its flexibility, the hull did not break, but moved with the wave. Modern engineers acknowledge it was precisely this liveliness of the design that allowed Vikings to reach Iceland, Greenland, and even the shores of North America. Every expedition was a gamble with death. Vikings knew if the sea claimed them, it would return only splinters. But fear did not prevent them from singing. During storms, they performed battle songs, low, rhythmic, to the beat of the oars, to drown out the sound of the wind. These songs echoed the philosophy of the northern world. If you die, the sea will accept you as a brother. And yet it was precisely in these voyages that the main secret of the Drakkar was hidden. It was not created for trade or glory. Its shape, flexibility, speed, everything pointed to one goal: landing, an instant strike, surprise. When Drakkars approached the enemy shore, their shadows merged with the horizon, and before the sentries could raise the alarm, the first warriors were already stepping onto the sand, ready to turn any shore into the beginning of a new saga. As the shore drew nearer, the Drakkars changed their appearance. With sails unfurled, they resembled birds. But as soon as the Vikings heard the sound of the surf, these birds transformed into predators. The sail was furled, oars were laid in the water, and the ship glided towards land almost silently. From that moment, what it was created for began: an instant invasion. The Drakkar's main strength was its shallow draft. Thanks to it, the vessel could approach the shore where other ships would run aground. Archaeologists in Iceland found remains of landings where Drakkars entered river mouths at a depth not exceeding a man's knee. This allowed 100 armed warriors to disembark literally within a minute. Modern military experts call this a prototype of an amphibious operation. A key concept explaining the Drakkar's combat power is the shield formation. This was not a tactical formation on land, but a defense system on the ship. Shields, fastened along the side, served not only as decoration, they covered the rowers from arrows and spears, transforming the drakkar into a mobile fortress. When disembarkation began, warriors removed their shields and instantly reformed into a wall, the famous shield wall or skjaldborg. This was the very moment when sea and land united into a single line of attack. Historians note that drakkars never operated alone. They traveled in flotillas of 20, 30, sometimes up to 100 vessels. Signals were given, not by flags as with later fleets, but by the sounds of horns. Each jarl had his own motif by which warriors recognized his voice. This signal echoed across the water, turning the fjord into a resonant battle hall. One English monk, an eyewitness to the raid on Lindisfarne, wrote, "We heard a trumpet blast, and the sea spoke with the voice of hell." During an attack, the ships turned their prows towards the shore. Each drakkar had a narrow gangplank called a bree. This was a wooden platform that was thrown onto the sand. Along it, one after another, armed warriors descended. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes. Enemies had not yet managed to gather, and the Vikings were already raising their standards on the coastal hills. One of the most important technical elements of the drakkar was hull balancing. During disembarkation, the weight shifted, and the ship could capsize. To prevent this, masters calculated the weight distribution in advance. Modern marine engineers, who analyzed reconstructions, noted the drakkar's center of gravity was ideally located between the mast and the middle of the keel. This allowed the vessel to remain stable even with a sudden rush of people onto the shore. When the attack concluded, the ship was not abandoned. It was pulled back into the water with ropes stretched over wooden rollers. The entire process took mere minutes. Thus, the flotilla could disappear from the horizon faster than an alarm could be raised. This element of surprise made the Vikings a legend, and their ships a symbol of fear throughout Europe. But it was not only war that made drakkars immortal. Trading voyages, exploratory expeditions, everything was built upon the same vessels. Archaeologists have found evidence of voyages to Byzantium and Baghdad, and some sources mention Scandinavian merchants who even reached the shores of the Caspian Sea. Vikings traded furs, slaves, amber, iron. Their ships became a bridge between the north and the east, between cold and sand. Interestingly, each flotilla had its own distinctions. Norwegians built drakkars that were narrow and light for stormy seas. Danes built wider ones with a larger cargo hold. And Swedish sneckars were distinguished by a long, almost serpentine hull, ideally suited for the rivers of Eastern Europe. All of these were variations of a single principle: speed and mobility. It was this principle that allowed drakkars to reach Iceland, Greenland, and then the mysterious land of Vinland on the coast of North America. In the year 2000, archaeologists at Longships confirmed Vikings indeed set foot there 500 years before Columbus. And they did so on those very same ships, created by hand, without blueprints or tools. But the most stunning discovery for modern historians was something else. At the bottom of Norway's fjords, traces of ships are found whose length exceeded everything we knew about Viking shipbuilding. Some sources claim up to 90 meters. Perhaps these were the flagship vessels of kings, built to display power. Perhaps sacred ships intended not for sailing but for burial rituals. And yet the question remains open. How could Vikings, without blueprints or metal tools, create something comparable in size to a modern frigate? The answer, it seems, lies deeper, in the fact that, for them, a ship was not a machine but a living creature. They did not build it, they gave birth to it. And when a drakkar set sail, its fate was as unpredictable as the very nature of the Northern Sea. When a drakkar completed its journey, it did not die. It transitioned into another world. Vikings believed a ship, like a human, has a soul. Therefore, the best among them did not rot in docks. They were burned. The burial rite, described in the Yngling saga, was a warrior's final journey. He was laid on the ship's deck, surrounded by weapons, shields, armor. The vessel was set ablaze, and the wind transformed the flames into wings, carrying the warrior to Odin. Archaeologists have found dozens of such burials. The most famous is the Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway. It was preserved almost completely, and when scientists cleared it, they saw not just a vessel, but a work of art. Carved dragons, patterns, ritual sleighs, fabrics with sun symbols. Even after 1,000 years, the smell of tar and wood was perceptible beneath layers of clay. Drakkars died not from time, but from change. When Europe transitioned to large merchant vessels and heavy warships, the flexible monsters of the north gave way to slow giants, but their spirit did not disappear. The principles of their construction, symmetry, buoyancy, strength despite lightness, formed the basis of many maritime technologies. Modern engineers admit it is impossible to replicate the precision of the curves and the flexibility of the Drakkar. They were not the result of calculation, but the result of feeling, that very same feeling that connected man and wood, wind and sea. And now, knowing their secrets, a question arises. Could we, armed with all technologies, build a ship that would live for 1,000 years and still be alive? Or is this skill a forever lost art of people for whom the sea was not a path, but destiny?